Hello and welcome to Understanding Transitional Justice. The topic for this week is gender injustice, and there are a lot of different directions that we can go in talking about relations between post-conflict justice and gender. What I'm going to do is to focus on three elements. I'm going to talk first, in the first section, about categories of violence and about the status of victimization. And then in the next two sections, the focus is going to be on reconciliation, a little bit on criminal processes. We're going to talk about categories of identity and difference, and we're going to talk about some of the expectations attached to reconciliation that are especially gendered. So first, in talking about violence and victimization, uh, one thing that we can say is that there are gender differences, which are not absolute differences, as I think you know, about the kinds of crimes and violence that people are likely to be victims of in a conflict situation. Men are more likely to be victims of killing. Women are more likely to be victims of sexual violence, refugees, to suffer displacement, to be surviving members of families. Now, when I talk about this, what we're talking about is probability. There are women who are victims of killing. There are women who participate in fighting, and there are men who are victims of sexual violence. This is an area on which there has not been a lot of legal attention, and there has not been a lot of research. This is a topic that's really only been picked up in literature over the past few years on conflict and post-conflict justice. But let's take a moment to consider this: the status of victimhood, to be a victim or a survivor. This is the status that is more likely to be assigned systematically to women. And what does this status mean? Uh, Here's the thing about appearing as a victim, whether it's appearing as a victim in acts of commemoration or in criminal trials, that is that taking on the role of the victim tends to reinforce already existing gender stereotypes. It tends to reinforce stereotypes about passivity. It tends to reinforce stereotypes about helplessness. And this is important because it is structuring for the kind of political role that is assigned to victims and the expectation of whether people who are assigned the status of victims are going to be politically active or politically passive, or encouraged to be politically active or politically passive in the post-conflict environment. One thing that justice activists tend not to like is the way that they put it, that the victims speak politically, or that the victims speak in political roles, because that is not the role assigned to them. What is the role assigned to them? It is a role that has political uses, but has very little political agency. The first is that the role of the victim in post-conflict political activity is to represent and to reaffirm the posture of moral superiority that is taken by a group, a politically defined group, usually an ethnic or national group, to which the victim is presented as being subordinate. Um, and this has a role in another of the post-conflict and post-violence activities that is always present. It's visible, but it is less emphasized because we like to be positive talking about justice and we don't like to talk as much about instrumentalization of justice. And that is competitive victimhood, the use and display and deployment of victims in order to establish victimhood status for a group, which is a claim to political capital, to moral capital that can be used to make claims, especially claims for compensation. There is another issue where law steps in and where gender becomes complex, and that is this: that the law is formally neutral. It does not formally treat people in different gender groups differently, but the law embodies notions of gender. It embodies ideas of what is normal or not normal for different genders. So that, for example, if we take, as Christy Campbell argues in her article, acts like sexual violence, the way that this is defined imposes categories of normalcy, which the crime becomes a crime by violating. So, in a sense, the affirmation of the fact that somebody is a victim of a crime through, for example, a criminal trial, is also the imposition of a kind of normalized gender role. Uh, this becomes a further conflict problem because crime is perceived, war crimes are perceived as taking place within the context of a violent conflict, a conflict between groups, and in many of the situations, most of the situations that we're talking about, between ethnic groups. And so sexual violence tends to be not only subordinated to stereotypical ideas of gender, but it tends to be ethnified. The crime is only understood as a war crime if it is understood as being directed against the group of which the victim is a member. And so a person is attacked not as a person, not even necessarily as a member of a gender group, but as a member of an ethnic or religious or national group. This becomes the superior identity, regardless of the degree to which the victims will perceive themselves as carrying that identity. A similar pattern that we can see in which roles of victimhood, victimization, and passivity are reproduced is through the process, generally speaking, the victim of a crime is going to appear in legal processes only as a witness, most often only as a witness to their own experience of having suffered as a victim of crime. There are gendered patterns in witnessing. You look at who appears as victims in criminal trials. When women appear, they most frequently appear as people who are personally victims of crimes. That is, not as expert witnesses, not as people involved in organization, not as active participants. Um, so this not only reinforces gender stereotypes, it also means that because this role, the roles of victim, expert, perpetrator, witness, and so on, are gendered, it means that the level of prosecution might not reflect the instances of crime. Most of the prosecutions for sexual violence, post-conflict prosecutions for sexual violence involve women as victims. We know that women are not the only victims of sexual violence, but there are structural reasons, both social ones and ones in the structure of legal processes, that discourage other victims from coming forward and identifying as victims of sexual violence. And what this means is that violence and the prosecution of violence is reflective of gender distinctions, and it is also productive of gender distinctions, or sometimes has the role of reinforcing gender distinctions. And so on balance, looking through the lens of victimization, if we understand gender as a form of ascribed distinction, a form of the formation of categories leading to difference in treatment, the interaction between gender and law becomes problematic. And this is something that we need to take into account when talking about legal approaches to gender-based violence.